Okay, well, I think a lot of people will hopefully be jumping in on the next couple minutes, but we can go ahead and make just some announcements and set out how this webinar will go today. So just want to start by thanking everyone for joining us. We think this is a really important topic, and that there's a lot that we've learned in reading all the research and putting this together as well, and we're excited to share that with you today. Just a couple of items. This webinar is an hour and a half, so it will end at 2:30. You are on mute, but you can type your questions or comments, as some of you have already done, in the question box or the chat box. So either way, we're keeping track. At some point during this webinar, there will be a couple of polls that also will be asking for your responses to questions or your reactions to certain things we'll put up on the screen. So we will be collecting those and trying to share them out to the group as a way to build in a little participation for this webinar. So plan on that. And just as kind of an overview, Kelly Davy-Dove and I are going to go over research conducted by the Frameworks Institute that was conducted in the early to mid-2000s, and it was initiated by Prevent Child Abuse America. And this research really offers great insight into how the public perceives child abuse and how we can communicate about prevention to more effectively reach the public. What they really wanted to know is, are we being effective with our messaging, and how can we be more effective? So this is really important as we think about trying to engage community members in our cause and our work. And so I think there'll be good information here, but this will also lay some good foundation for the webinar on Monday, August 12th, and that's on how to better engage the media in our cause and our work too. So we will get into some of the media frames and some of what we'll be discussing during that webinar of how to actually approach the media. With this presentation, we're going to go through how child abuse and prevention is framed in the media and more generally our communities. We're going to look at what frames will better communicate our message and how can we use these new frames to gain better public understanding and support. I should note we are recording this webinar, so it can hopefully be shared with those who couldn't attend. There were several people who wanted to attend but couldn't. And Kelly and I are also available after the webinar, so if you want to talk more about the research or have any additional questions that aren't answered, we are here to help, and we're also here to provide individual support as you look at implementing some of these messages in your own work. Another important resource, this is a great website, is the www.frameworksinstitute.org/toolkits/CANP, and that lays out all of the research this presentation is based on today, and also some really good applications, so how to do some of the messaging that we will talk about. Before we begin, I've never tried this before, but we're going to try it. I have a couple of polls. So I have a poll in process and just wanted to see, have you seen this research before, this reframing? Just another minute. Okay. 71% are saying no, 24% yes, and 6% don't know. So that's definitely a lot of people who have not seen this before, which is great. For those of you who have, I still learn a lot every time I go through it. And for those who aren't sure, this is one that we have shared at a couple, it would have been at a child abuse prevention conference a few years ago, and we've done some training at regional meetings, but it has been probably 3 or 4 years, I think, since we've really put this out. So you might, some of this might be familiar, but we've also retooled some of it as well, so some of it might be new, and it's always a good refresher if you haven't been through it before. So we will now, let me see if I can switch. And so this next question is, and for those who maybe have not seen this before, it might be difficult to answer, but are you using new prevention messaging in your materials? So I'll leave that vague. Okay, I'll go ahead and close that poll. It looks like 47% say yes, 35% no, and 18% don't know. So I think this will be good as we, I lost my presentation, but as we start to get into this, you'll probably have a better sense of that. And then for those who haven't before, again, Kelly and I are available to help and think about how to integrate some of what you hear today into your materials if you'd like afterwards. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started, and I'll start by turning it over to Kelly. I will just note that I'm trying to manage controls and present, so if I don't get to your question right away, I will definitely try. So bear that in mind. I'll turn it over to Kelly now.
Hi, everyone. This is Kelly Davidov. Again, I want to thank you for your time this afternoon to join us for the webinar. As Sarah mentioned, we will both be on the presentation today, although I'm just going to prepare you that Sarah is my driver with the slides, so hopefully we can stay coordinated as we go throughout the presentation. But again, I'm glad that you're taking the time this afternoon to spend some time learning about different communication strategies and how we have worked to really change our communication and our messaging over the last few years. It's really actually pretty interesting information, and there's some good research behind it as well. So I just want to start talking a little bit about working on communication strategies, how we develop them. I think it's important to keep in mind the difference between information and communication, and I really like this quote. Basically, it says 2 words, information and communication, are often used interchangeably, but they signify quite different things. Information is giving out, communication is getting through. Simply giving out information, what we've learned from the research that we've seen is that, whether you're giving out statistics, facts, or some other type of information about what you're doing, it just isn't quite enough. It can increase knowledge, but it doesn't really create a call for change or for action. So if our goal is to change how people connect with and engage in our work, we really need to communicate with them in a way that means they're going to, A, understand what we want them to do, and understand how they can do that, how they can be a part of that and really help. So our goal is more to get through, not just to give out the information. You want to switch slides there? Okay. So how do we go about communicating in a way that calls for change or action? Well, one of the ways that we can do that is by using messaging. Messaging essentially takes into account the following things. We look at what it is the public knows and thinks about child abuse, and specifically child abuse prevention. It looks at what we know about how to prevent child abuse, and then also what we want to get out of any communication. So what our goals are. How do we want people to feel? How do we want them to think? And what do we want people to do? These are all really important questions to think about and to lay the foundation for any communication strategy, because they help us determine how to communicate what we know in order to get what we want. So what is it that we actually want? How do we want people to react to our message? Do we want them to feel angry, shocked, outraged, or do we want them to feel hopeful and invested and empathetic to our cause? The end result of our communication, or what we get out of it, really depends on how people react to our communication. If we are communicating with the intent of shocking people and creating a sense of outrage, they're likely to walk away probably feeling overwhelmed, hopeless. They're not likely to feel like they can personally do anything to help. And what we end up doing is really running the risk of alienating the very audiences that we hope to reach. So if the ultimate point of our communication is to create action in some way, what is that action that we want people to take? if we want people to feel engaged and empowered, we really need to work to present the problem in a solvable light. So how do we make all of that happen? That's the question. And I really like this quote as well. It basically says, to effectively communicate, we must realize that we are all different in the way we perceive the world and use this understanding as our guide to our communication with others. Everyone approaches our message of child abuse prevention with their own personal history. That personal history is going to shape their reactions in very, very powerful ways. And so understanding something about how that process works, how people perceive our work, is going to help us effectively communicate going forward. You want to switch slides there? So I want to spend a little time now talking about framing, what that means, how we use it to shape our messages, et cetera. And again, we all approach different messages with our own personal history, or if you want to think about it, it's really our own frame of reference. So our frame of reference, or framing, sets the tone for how we receive and react to new information. As the communicator, it's really important to understand the audience's frame of reference, or frames perhaps, because this allows us to construct our message in a way that will be acceptable so we can get through to them and not just give out. And again, I think one of the easiest ways to think about framing is it's really, who you are, where you've been, what you know, and your experiences that provides your frame of reference for any new information. And again, so understanding that process is really crucial as a communicator. So the power of framing. One of the nice things that the Frameworks Institute was able to do for us was to present some generalizations about the most common frames of reference that people have in relation to our message of child abuse prevention. Sarah and I are going to spend some time talking about each one of those sort of general frames, but I really wanted to point out first just how very powerful an individual's frame of reference can be. So overall, their frame of reference is more powerful than any facts that you may present, and that's kind of why we have the when the facts don't fit the frame wins. And I wanted to give you an example of kind of how this can work. So to understand how powerful these frames can be, if you spent your whole life, let's say, believing that the earth was flat, so all of your personal experience of the world suggested that the earth was flat, other people in your life reinforced that maybe, and then someone came along and told you that it was in fact round, no matter how much evidence they might provide, you're likely to still think that the earth is flat, or at least it might change. It takes some time for you to change your frame of reference about that and actually accept that the earth is round. Those frames of reference are very, very powerful. And in fact, I actually just learned yesterday that there is still indeed a flat earth society. So that tells you exactly how powerful some of these frames can be. When the facts don't fit the frame wins. And so that can be a really big challenge as a communicator in trying to overcome some of those barriers. I don't know if there's any Stephen Colbert fans out there, but I like this quote as well. It says, "I'm not a fan of facts, you see. The facts can change, but my opinion will never change no matter what the facts are." I think this can pretty well sum up much of our own internal dialogue and how we often, just as individuals, approach any new information. So what are these frames of reference that we're dealing with as communicators? I want to spend some time talking about what shapes a person's frame of reference, and specifically what the public knows and what they think about child abuse and child abuse prevention. So essentially, the public knows exactly what we tell them. They know what they see, they know what they hear, and they know what they read. And that's assuming everyone reads. So I want to spend a little time just talking about what it is that they actually see, hear, and read. And these are all things that will shape their frames of reference. So on this slide, you will see several different examples of what we have historically shown people. This is what people see. You see images that are sort of dark and shadowy, intimidating figures hovering over children who are cowering in the corner, pictures of children who have been battered, very graphic pictures sometimes with headlines that are pretty striking and pretty jarring. These are oftentimes depicting very extreme cases, which are not typically what most abuse looks like. And they're really sort of going for that shock value. We're trying to kind of incite outrage and shock in the people that are viewing these images. The next slide shows even more examples. And again, you'll see on the left there's a picture of a terribly battered child with a caption that says, "Some things can't be healed with bandages. Guess who had a bad day at work?" And you've got an image of a very sad-looking child. These are very, very powerful images, and they're very, very shocking. And so these kinds of images is what we've historically put out there for people, and this is what people take with them when they walk away from our message. The next slide shows even more examples. This is oftentimes what people hear and I guess see as well. You know, they'll see sort of the mugshot of the parent, that bad parent who did a bad thing. Very extreme cases, child pornography, Datelines to Catch a Predator. All of these kinds of stories and these images really lead folks to associate child abuse with sort of the sensationalism. It invokes fear of strangers, gives them a very distorted view of who perpetrators typically are. It often, the result that we get is not typically maybe what we would want, but maybe end up being calls for tougher laws, tougher sentences, things that are more on the other end of the prevention continuum other than where we would maybe like folks to go. So again, these are just some of the examples that have been put out there, but I wanted to take a break quickly and just ask you, the attendees, how you feel when you see these images. Where does your mind go when you see pictures of children like this or pictures of abuse stories? How are you feeling after looking at them? And so if you don't mind just going ahead and typing some comments into the chat box and let us know how you feel when you see these. What's your initial reaction?
I got a comment of sad.
Sad.
Helpless. Fear. I feel angry and don't want to look any further.
Anyone else care to comment? Okay, so what we heard is these images are making you feel sad, helpless, fearful, angry. You're kind of wanting to turn away. Yeah, I guess I would ask the question, you know, from a communication standpoint, if our goal is to have you, our audience, do something about child abuse prevention, did this leave you feeling like you could make a difference? My guess is probably not. If you're feeling helpless and angry and afraid and you would just rather maybe not look at the image or the message, you're not probably feeling overly engaged or empowered or like you could personally make a difference or stop abuse or be helpful in some way. And so I think it's a worthwhile exercise to go through to gauge your own reactions to these, because this is where the public has gone. This is what we've been showing them. This is what we've been telling them over all of these years. And it really has been detrimental to our cause because we're not engaging people. They don't feel like it's something that they can help with. They don't want to look at it. It turns them off. They feel angry and overwhelmed. And they're not going in a direction where we necessarily want them to go. So really what we've not done is create a call for action. And again, here's just a few more examples. I mean, these are some of the headlines that folks read. They're very, very graphic. They're very extreme cases. And so I don't think that these kinds of headlines and these kinds of images are, you know, are likely to make our audience, the public, our communities, feel like they have a stake in this and like they can actively benefit the families in the community, because this is what they hear and this is what they see. So
So I will talk a little bit about more in depth about what kind of frames are in the media and how this is shaping people's perspectives. So while the media stories have increased awareness of child abuse, they tend to focus on those shocking stories that are simplified to one particular extreme case without a greater context of the overall problem. Because of this, people know abuse happens. There's some awareness there. We don't need to keep telling them that. But they also know that it can be bad. We've already got that shock factor down. But what people need to know is that we are doing something to prevent abuse. There are stories that offer us hope, and the community can be a part of these efforts. So we'll look a little more closely at how the media frames its stories. And these are the main frames you'll see. These frames shape the perceptions people have about child abuse and prevention. So I think it's important to look closely at each of these frames to have a better understanding of what does the public hear and see and how that influenced their knowledge about the issue. And also to know how do we begin to work with the media to not reinforce frames that we know aren't helpful to our cause. So in other words, how can we steer the conversation with reporters in a way that reshapes the discussion about child abuse in a way that refocuses it more on prevention? So in the next few slides, we'll look at each of these frames a little more in depth. With this first frame, these are generally the story that reads, someone really bad did something really bad. And so it focuses on a worst-case scenario. It's very easy to blame the individual and not to look at the greater problem. It tends to focus on only the smallest percentages of child abuse cases without putting them in any real context of overall the issue of child abuse. And there's no room for solutions. With this next frame, you'll see these stories tend to blame DHS for a bad outcome. So they're always focused on everything DHS did wrong, but you never hear any of the good things DHS does. So as a result, the public will condemn the system without thinking about how to reform it. It creates feelings that the government is incompetent and lacks accountability. And it gives people the idea that communities can't work together, as exhibited by our failed system. With this one, you have stories of people that it's usually that monster who did something terrible to that child. And this causes people to think that we're surrounded by monsters and we need to keep our children safe. And this is really a false sense of security, because when we know a lot by the facts that many cases of sexual abuse are with someone the family knows and trusts. And it doesn't open the room for discussion about risk factors of abuse because we can't identify with those monsters. And it creates this sense of fear and distrust of the greater community, especially when you hear those stories about clergy abuse or abuse within the Boy Scouts or teachers. These are people the family depends on for support, but they're portrayed in a light that we can't trust them. So another frame is discipline versus abuse. And with this story, it's often about a parent that went too far. For example, in the Des Moines Register, there was an article recently about a grandmother who was being investigated after someone saw her hit her grandson in Walmart. And so the story leads to more of a debate about what is proper parenting and when does it go too far, instead of that collective sense of thinking about a child's welfare. It puts the emphasis on the family to decide how to discipline and what is best for their family. There's not really that community involvement. And it doesn't allow for a discussion about how children develop and how we support that development. There's no discussion about a child's well-being and being brought up the process of that development. And with the final frame we really see is that of the sanctity of the family. And with these kinds of stories, they're typically about the government interfering with someone's right to parent. So they yanked the child out of the home, threw him into foster care, only to find out the parent was wrongly accused. And the problem with this frame is that it puts the family well-being before the child's well-being, and it creates that fear of the government taking children away and destroying families. But it can also lead to the idea that the government didn't do enough to remove the children. And those kinds of stories are, they ignored signs and pleas from family and neighbors that something was wrong, and suddenly something bad happened. Overall, the focus of this frame is on the sanctity of the family. So there's the fear created about getting involved in somebody else's family, and that diminishes the bystander role in preventing abuse. It doesn't allow for a discussion about community support for families. And this can lead to difficulties when you think about, for example, our home visiting programs where someone is entering a family's home. How do you approach that subject when there's that fear of somebody coming into a family and telling them what to do or taking their children away? So I think when we look at the media, and again, this is really setting us up well for our August 12th webinar, but we need to think about the existing frames and how do we move from that. So the existing frames are highlighting the problem in a way that isolates people from it. There's not a greater understanding of why child abuse happens and what role someone can play in preventing it. Instead, it's that sense of shock, outrage, and helplessness in solving the issues. So what we need to do is think about what is news when it comes to child abuse and prevention. And stories about new programs, new grant awards, new research studies, maybe a mom who faced a stressful time but has been supported by her community. All of these start to lead to more of a discussion about healthy child development and overall community development. It also highlights the solutions that are being done to some of the to address some of these issues. And I think it's also important we need to think about how we're putting the issue into context. So when a reporter calls and asks us the typical question we all get asked, which is how many children are abused and neglected each year, how do we put this question in a context that's leading towards more of the message we want people to hear versus just, again, reiterating the number of how many children are abused each year. So with that, I have an example. So here's the common question, and I've gotten it many times in interviews too, no matter what the subject is that we're talking about. For some reason, reporters always go back to how many children are abused and neglected each year. And here's the typical answer. I'll give you a second to read. So with this response, we have data that is difficult to understand and seems overwhelming. It keeps the conversation lodged within parental responsibility. We're focusing on who is abusing, neglecting, and maltreating kids. And it doesn't highlight any community support and influences into this, preventing this from happening. So here's an example of how we change that conversation. And again, we're going to get into more examples of reframing later on. But I wanted you to see early on, here's how we have an opportunity to reshape what's in the news. And I'll give you a second to read this as well. So you see with the second response that it establishes right away why an audience should care. It puts the data into context and connects it to a solution. It says here, because a third of children are reported as abused or neglected are children under 4 years of age, and most are in the child protection system for the first time, we are focusing on innovative programs that can intervene early. Right away, it puts the problem in a different light, and it provides a solution to that problem. It also uses the pay now or pay later frame that we're going to get into more, but that kind of, we can do something now about it with policies and by investing in children early versus waiting till something bad happens later on. And you'll notice how it still uses the same data as before, but it's putting it into a context that people have a better understanding of and can understand how do we begin to address this problem. And this was taken from that Frameworks Institute website that I offered earlier at the presentation, and I'll show again at the end. And so I think it's really helpful to look at some of these common responses to think about how do we reshape the questions we tend to get asked. With that, I'll turn it back over to Kelly.
Okay, so Sarah just spent some time talking about, the media and how that influences people's frames of reference, and went through some examples of how to reframe that. But it's also really important to be able to communicate with people in ways that don't necessarily involve the media. So if you are, considering other types of awareness activities, like a special event or some sort of general communication piece, like a brochure, it's worthwhile to spend some time talking about two other frames that really shape how the public reacts to our message. And they get reinforced in the media as well, but they're a little bit different than some of how the media stories end up playing out. And so these are essentially the other minds frame and the family bubble frame. So the other minds frame really deals with the tendency of some people to place unrealistic expectations or a characterization on people or things. It gets at the psychological process of imagining you know what someone or maybe even something else is thinking. And so as an example of this actually happens to me quite often, but usually when I go to the grocery store, I'm in a hurry, I want to just get in and get out, and I know that as soon as I choose a checkout lane, the cash register is going to break down. The person in front of me will want to write out a check and balance their entire checkbook, and usually 5 million other things happen to get in the way because they all know that I'm in a hurry and they're trying to slow me down on purpose, right? So that is me sort of putting my own projection onto other people and other things and imagining that I know they're all trying to do something to me on purpose. That's really kind of what the other minds frame is all about. Now, the difficulty is that when this sort of thinking is applied to parenting and to how children behave, it can really lead to some risk. It tends to lead people to view children as a threat. Like, for instance, that infant is crying on purpose because they know that I'm tired today. They're misbehaving on purpose just to make me mad. It can lead parents to view discipline as more of like a tit-for-tat sort of way to get back at them. Because, of course, we know that they're doing this on purpose. So you can see how this kind of thinking can really lead to some distortions. It can lead to sort of a get-over-it syndrome, the unrealistic expectation that children should be able to learn right from wrong and should cognitively be able to change their behavior, and at an age that's not always appropriate. It can also lead to sort of a mind over matter philosophy of resiliency. That's sort of, well, if I could pull myself up by my bootstraps, you should be able to as well. So that's sort of that idea that some children who were abused turn out just fine, so why don't others? And the problem with this frame, and it's a fairly common one, I think a lot of people have some of these perceptions, is that it really does not leave room to discuss the effects of developmental damage early on. It can also lead to some other distortions as we look at the different kinds of abuse. So the distortion around the cycle of abuse is typically that the cycle of abuse is seen as something that's learned rather than the result of damage and trauma early on. Sexual abuse can end up being distorted because this kind of thinking can lead to seeing children as somehow capable of adult sexuality. And oftentimes this gets played out in terms of predators, thinking that the children somehow seduce them or something along those lines. It can also have an impact when we think about how difficult it is to view this type of behavior in someone we know. We just sort of think that it's unimaginable, like that person's not capable of that kind of abuse. It's very far outside of the norm. When it comes to neglect, this can lead to some distorted thinking as well. Neglect is often sort of that nebulous issue that's generally attributed to underinvolvement of parents. So examples of this would be sort of the, kids these days are allowed to just run wild and they play too many video games, sort of generalizations about just bad parenting. And people don't often understand that parent-child interaction is really impactful on development. And so this other minds frame really lets us dismiss the effects of the environment on children and on infants, that they're too young to be affected, they aren't going to remember anything, those kinds of things. And then it can also lead to distortions around mental abuse. Again, it sort of gets at the issue of children not being viewed realistically as children, that they sort of are viewed more as having adult traits, and so it's easier to yell at them or easier to expect things that they're not capable of delivering. So the other minds frame is, like I said, it's very, very powerful. And there are certain risk factors that I think contribute to this kind of thinking. Stress is often something that can lead to this. Again, back to my grocery store example, this usually happens when I'm stressed out and I'm in a hurry and I have 5 other things that I need to do before I get home. So stress can lead to adultification of children, to viewing them as being more adult-like and not having realistic expectations of their behavior. Family isolation is another one that can lead to more intense interaction with children, and so that can lead to viewing them as if they're more like a peer or an adult rather than as a child. Individualism is another risk factor that can have an impact on the other minds type of thinking. This whole value placed on wanting our children to be as self-reliant as possible as soon as possible. So there's some risk factors that contribute to that, but there's also ways that we can combat or sort of fight against this whole other minds barrier. One of the best ways to try to get past this other minds thinking is by understanding and using solid research behind child development so that we can present child development in an objective light, so that we can present the opportunity to learn positive discipline practices that are objectively shown to be effective, so that we can help folks understand the importance of brain development and that it's more than just cognitive sort of emotional development that can be impacted, but actually the brain structure can be impacted by the environment and adverse experiences. And then also helping parents deal with stress management can sort of combat some of those risk factors that lead to the other mind distortions. So the other frame that I wanted to spend a little bit of time on is the family bubble frame. And this kind of ties in with the sanctity of the family frame that Sarah had talked about earlier. But this really deals with the concept of the family as an independent, isolated unit, not necessarily connected to the greater community. This really gets at the whole idea that what happens in the family stays in the family. And this can lead to a lot of things. It can lead to isolation, distrust of others, of programs and services, of the community. It can lead to the concept that the family should be able to discipline as they choose, and ultimately that the parents' rights end up trumping those of the children. And so again, this whole frame really doesn't leave much room for the family to either ask for help or for anyone to offer it. And we want to change that. We want to get to more of a community response and a community responsibility to our families. So when we look at the family bubble versus the village, and I would say that the village is really the direction that we want to go with our messaging, how do we communicate so that we encourage people to be the responsible villager? We can use a lot of simple messages, and they actually are quite succinct and quite simple. So things like, a child is helpless, you are not. Protecting children is everyone's business. That's one that we use quite often. You can provide a simple list of ways to help prevent child abuse. And these kinds of messages leave room for people to get involved. It encourages them to do something. They can walk away feeling empowered, like they have some tools to perhaps be effective. But I guess I would just throw out the caution that if you try to pit these two frames against each other, the family bubble versus the responsible villager, the family bubble is going to win. It is the more powerful of the two frames, if you will, at least for now. Hopefully with our communication efforts, maybe that will change. But when we're talking about promoting the village, Sarah, do you want to switch slides? It's important to continuously promote the sense of the village in our communication strategies. Again, we want to establish the idea of the village and the responsible villager as more of a community standard, as a normalized concept for people in our communities. Again, the last slide showed some examples of really simple messages we can use, but we do have to be careful, as I said, when we're talking about constructing our message. One of the cautions I would recommend is to avoid overly difficult or complicated recommendations. So as an example of that, some of our examples were very simple on the previous slide, but you would want to avoid using a communication strategy that would be again, overly complicated. So, for example, if you're in Walmart and you see a parent strike their child, here are the top 5 things you should do. The problem with overly difficult and complicated recommendations is that people are not likely to remember them, first of all, and they can end up feeling overwhelmed and paralyzed and not feeling like they can do anything, or perhaps preferring not to do anything. So stick to the simple messages whenever possible, and then avoid forcing the issue when it comes to the village concept versus the family bubble. We want to be as cautious as we can when constructing our message around these 2 frames. So, for example, one way to avoid pitting them against each other would be to state your message as more of a positive light. So families spending more time with children are less likely to abuse would be one way to state that, versus family isolation can lead to abuse. That's more of a negative way that actually pits those 2 frames up against each other. So again, just using caution in how we talk about these and how we construct our message, but then hand in hand with that is sort of that continuous promotion of the village to kind of normalize that concept and help folks feel empowered to become engaged in our work. So with that, I will turn that over to Sarah to dive right into how we reframe our messages.
And before actually we move into reframing, I just kind of want to pause for a moment and see if we can get any comments, questions, anything you want us to talk about for a minute before we move on about any of the frames that we've just gone over. And again, you can type those into your question box or the chat box. I'll give one more second. Any questions coming through? Okay, I'm not seeing any, so if you have them along the way, feel free to type them in, and we can address them, and there'll be time at the end of this presentation as well for that. So we're going to go ahead and get into reframing, and I think, if I can change the slide, one of the things to think about this is where people are right now. And so we've already won the first battle. We've made people aware that child abuse exists. When they did this research, they found 91% are aware that child abuse exists. But the messaging has failed to help people understand what prevention actually means. When they think about prevention, they think about it as reporting abuse, punishing bad parents and offenders, and having public registries, which are things that happen after the fact, after something has already happened. And even, it's important to note that 50% even agree that prevention is possible. So there's a long ways to go in this arena. And I think part of that is you look at messages like these that we tend to see about prevention. And it says, how can I prevent abuse? Understand the cause of abuse, learn to recognize signs of abuse, report suspected abuse, seek help if you're at risk of abusing, and reach out to a family in need. And a lot of these are suggestions that would happen after the fact, after something has already happened, before really thinking about how do we even avoid having to get to the point of having to recognize the signs and having to report suspected abuse. And there's some other concerns with this as well. The framework study found that most parents feel unprepared to parent, but they don't feel that a lack of preparation actually led to abuse or neglect. So we're asking parents to seek help if they're at risk of abusing, but they don't think that they're at risk, or they don't see that they would ever get to that point. Many people agree that parents need help but shouldn't have to ask for it. So how do we know if a parent is struggling, and when is it appropriate to reach out and help them? And there's also some mixed signals here. It's saying reach out to a family in need, but then report suspected abuse. And this can evoke the family bubble response that we've been talking about, where there's a fear that if you seek help or let somebody in, your kids could be taken away. And you also see a message like this one that came from Prevent Child Abuse America a few years ago. And I'm going to pause again and get your reaction to this. What is your reaction as you see this ad? You can type it in the question or chat box. What are any reactions you're having as you take a look at this? Pain is what somebody said. Ridiculous, exclamation point. Angry, defensive. I think that's good. So, and then when you start to read the bottom part, if you can't see that enough, it says preventing child abuse and neglect doesn't mean just reporting it. Instead, you can help stop it before it ever starts. And it goes on to say what you can do to prevent it. But when you look at it, the attention is really at the top part, at the burner, and the horrible message about abuse. And so the message, the image that we have isn't fitting the message that we want people to leave with. And so we think about how do we begin to change this? Well, think about, you can look to the Above the Influence campaign that focuses on preventing teen drinking as an example. And before they used to say, don't be one of the people who drink. And now they flipped it around to say, be part of the majority who don't drink. And in this much more positive light, you suddenly realize, okay, I'm actually part of the cool crowd if I don't drink. And so it frames it in a much more positive light. And that's the direction we're looking to go with this reframing. So the impact we want to have is we want community involvement and support in our efforts. We want to show the larger impact of abuse and to open the door to have that conversation on how abuse can be prevented. In order to do that, the researchers found that we need to include a positive connection to community, an emphasis on society's responsibility for children, an understandable model for child development, a focus on the objective of raising healthy children and policies that will help us reach that objective, and have that be the focus rather than child abuse as the frame of reference. We also need to limit discussion on individual parents and only in ways that support a role for society to really make this a bigger community issue. So we're now going to look at some of the new frames that have come about through this research. And these frames primarily focus on two main areas. You have child development, which opens the door to the larger societal impact of abuse and how it can be prevented. And you also have how the community can play a role in preventing abuse. And you'll notice that these help simplify our prevention concepts, and they give people real concrete analogies and metaphors that they can hold on to that kind of simplify what we're trying to do and stay in their mind a little easier. So with the development frames, you have these frames really work against the idea that children don't remember or can overcome abuse in their lifetime. So it lays the foundation to explain how child abuse impacts an entire community and why we need to make the investments early on. And so with brain architecture, what you really have is a concrete physical way of talking about this issue. There's lots of science behind it you can bring in, and it gets over the idea that every child is unique with limitless possibilities, that there's a process of development that takes place that leads people to who they are today. And it also really reminds people that K through 12 development begins with birth. You see a lot of discussion about education, and this has become a real big value in our society, that our kids need to be educated and so that they're prepared for, the workforce, or that, they're ready to start school on time. But there's not that real discussion about that education process taking place right away at birth. And so you also have the serve and return frame. And this is reminding people that there's an important process that's taking place between parent and child, and also looking at caregivers that are surrounding that child, and that back and forth stimulation is really important to development. You have a can't do one without the other frame, and that allows people to really connect the dots. So it's explaining how all development is really interrelated, and it gets away from just a lot of people have the view of development as a physical process, but there's also emotional and mental capabilities that are being developed right along with that physical development. So again, it gets at the idea that education begins before kindergarten and that there's a lot of value in those first few years. You also have the frame of toxic stress. And this is when a lot of you have probably seen the Adverse Childhood Experience study and have pulled some of that in it from time to time. But it's really looking at, so you have the positive stress that's short-lived, like taking a test. You have tolerable stress that something maybe really bad happened, but you have supportive relationships there to help you deal with it. But then you have this toxic stress, which is extreme cases such as child abuse and neglect, and this ultimately damages the brain. And it's used to get at the idea of how we end up with issues such as juvenile delinquency or poor school performance or mental health issues down the road. That there's this notion that you can't just get over it, that while there's resiliency and we all love those stories of hope, there is also long-term consequences that happen because of abuse and neglect. And then you look at some community frames. So how do we take these development frames and really think about them in the broader context of a community? And the pay now or pay later is a big one, especially thinking about talking to businesses. You can bring in issues of health care and these important issues that we're dealing with in our society, and how a lot of them really stem from early child development. And that you also can start to bring in cost here, and the cost of child abuse down the road, and how only a fraction is spent to actually prevent it from ever occurring. And you have return on investment, that idea of invest now and we'll see the benefits over time. So it brings in that desire to want to do something as a community. I think the Prosperous Society frame is really an important one, because this is the one that's really connecting all the pieces together for me, that this child development really is the foundation for so much more in our community. And I think it's one that people really connect to. It gets, again, at that idea, making it a value, whereas we think of education and how we value all our kids becoming educated. This type of frame really makes it, we need to be thinking early, and how do we support families and children from the beginning. And it gets beyond the parental blame. It reminds people what's at stake, that it isn't just these bad parents out there, but that because abuse is happening, it really is a problem that affects us all. And I think another important one to think about is the ingenuity frame. And this is, again, looking at the value that thinking about prevention provides. And it's looking at, we know what works, we know what's cutting edge, we have solutions that can be applied to this problem. And so we're providing ways that do work. So we'll now look how some of these look like and some of the common messages that we use. And in these next slides, it'll go fairly quickly, but you'll start to see a lot of the messages that we, through Prevent Child Abuse America, have really, or Prevent Child Abuse Iowa, have really latched onto, and you'll see them over and over again used in different ways. And I think they serve as really good key sound bites to keep in mind as you work on your own messaging. So this is really our vision statement for our organization, and it's that focus on prevention is promoting happy, healthy childhood experiences. And so it brings in the community, that our goal here is to support every child, and it, not just blame bad parents, but to really play a role. Every child deserves a safe, nurturing environment. Another message we use, child development provides an essential foundation in a person's life. And then you can go in to talk about how that foundation can be destroyed. So thinking about the development frames that we had mentioned, but bringing in the idea, too, of toxic stress, but framing it in a positive light to begin with, that it begins with an essential, with good child development. Here's how it can get taken off track, but here's how we're working to solve that. We have the message, most parents want to be good parents, and we can support them in building protective factors. So we're not just talking about the risk factors or what leads to abuse, but it's in a more positive way, that we're working with families. And it brings in that ingenuity frame, that we have solutions. We have a way of working with families that is going to reduce the likelihood of abuse and neglect. You have the message of, thankfully, existing programs are available to educate and support parents and are proven to prevent child abuse. So again, that ingenuity frame, that we have solutions, but then bringing in, here's where the community can play a role. Not all these programs are accessible to all families across the state. And so it opens that door for inviting the community in. You can play a role in helping us reach all families. We know this works. And really the Prosperous Society frame here, and the one that I think really helps people see the larger impact of our work. A community that invests in children will see the reward as the next generation grows to be productive, responsible citizens. So again, especially a strong business case for why this issue relates. For every $50 spent to treat child abuse, only $1 spent to prevent it in the first place. So the pay now, pay later frame, that if we start to make investments earlier on, we can work to address some of the issues that might arise from abuse. So it's going back to instilling that need for empathy with the issue and the support that we're looking for. So through the Frameworks Institute, they offered these guidelines, and I'll kind of go through each one because sometimes just looking at them doesn't always, I think, clarify what they're getting at. But when we think about how to do these messages, and from my perspective as a communication person, I've just kept those sound bites on hand. I even post them to my wall and can use those, and it's easier to think about those sound bites as I'm writing. But these guidelines, I think, are helpful to keep in mind as well. They're more guidelines, and I wouldn't get too wrapped up with them, and every time you try to start a communication piece, make sure you follow everything to a T. But with these guidelines, they talk about start with the preventive solution. So most people think of solutions lie in the legal system, but what really is prevention? So again, putting it in context for people. Include a clear definition of the problem and cause, that it's not just that it's situations, not just bad people, helping people understand it's not these worst case scenarios out there, but it's a larger societal issue. Another guideline is to avoid dramatic details in worst cases. So sometimes a story about a parent who has helped through a community program or a community program that's been really effective is also news, and I think sometimes we overlook that for the big, powerful story of something bad happened. And so to think about what are those stories of the public really stepping up and playing a role in prevention. A lot of newspapers and TV stations love those feel-good stories as well. Another guideline is tell stories of efficacy. So here's what we're doing to address the problem and why it makes a difference. Another guideline is forget numbers. So we don't really know with those child abuse numbers how much is too much. You can't really compare them from state to state, and just the fact that children are being abused is an issue. So forget about the numbers and let's think about what the real issue is that we're working to address. Stop fighting the fight we've won. And this refers to that people are already aware of abuse, so now let's give them solutions. Let's help them understand how do we move beyond just knowing that abuse exists. Bring multiple actors into the picture. So this is an opportunity to show much more people in the community playing a role, that it's not just a personal problem. And so it gets at, if you're showing an image of a child and a parent, it might even be more effective to show an image of, parent-child with a caregiver and other people surrounding that family, that there's much more people involved in that family's life rather than just the family itself. And then avoid conflicting calls to action. And this gets back to, reach out and support parents, but if you see anything, report abuse. And this kind of conflicting call that might cause some people to not get invested or to do anything because they're fear of getting involved in a family. So I think just with a couple more examples, and then we'll open it up to questions as well. But so you start to see this in our Pinwheels for Prevention campaign. And over the past 2 years, a lot of you are probably familiar with this. But its focus is on the positive childhood experiences and on the community coming out. You see the community planting pinwheel gardens and handing out pinwheels, and that idea of the community coming out to support children and working towards providing those safe, nurturing environments for every child. So, it's getting again at that message that it's up to all Iowans to step up and really ensure that all children are safe and have that happy childhood that you see represented in a pinwheel. And this is Kelly's son, which is really cute. I have to tell everybody that. And then the final one you see is an example of what we did for Child Abuse Prevention Month. And so with this, we did a card that really tried to engage parents with a positive message and people in the community. People, even if they didn't have kids, picked up the card and just, they would sigh or say, oh, this is really sweet. And so it was this positive message that grabs people in. And then on the back, you'll notice that we have join our efforts. So with every communication piece we've done, we've really worked to try to say, okay, you've learned what we do. Now here's the next step you can take. You can learn about child abuse and prevention strategies. You can get involved in local efforts. You can donate. You can stay updated in our work. And coming up with things that are very simple and easy for people to grasp. So I think with that, there are some sources here that you can look at. On the next page will also be the framework's website as well. But I want to just, again, note that Kelly and I are available. We're happy to go over any part of this research if you'd like. And as you're developing these new messages or awareness materials, we're more than happy to review them and to help you think about how to even develop them from the beginning. We really love helping out in any way that we can and getting involved. I personally love any kind of communication project. So we're always open. Feel free to email us or call. And we'd also love to see examples of any new messaging that you've done, and even in contrast of some of the old messaging you might have used. If there's any examples you'd be willing to share, we're always looking for new opportunities to highlight good work going on across the state. So again, please let us know how we can help. And with that, we'll open it up for questions, if anybody has any questions or comments that they want to share. And I guess we still, it's only 2 o'clock, so we have plenty of time. So we'll see how far people want to stay on and have this discussion afterwards. So thanks a lot for joining us. And we'll wait. So in the question box or chat box, feel free to type in any question or comment. Not seeing any questions out there. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, good question. Well, you have this presentation on your website. We are recording the presentation right now, so if all goes well technology-wise, I will save that and I will email you a link and try to see about posting it on the website as well. So I will let you know that as well, and that will include the PowerPoint. Someone asked, will the PowerPoint be available for us to use as we work with communities? And yeah, we can definitely talk about sharing that as well, especially if you need some reference as you start to work with the rest of the members in your council or site. Someone mentioned, would you so appreciate examples of brochures and handouts? I think that's really good. So, you know, if there's a place that people can use as examples, if you're willing to share those, we would love to post them. On our website, we have a grantee section that many of you are probably familiar with, and there's a public awareness button underneath that. So I will make sure we try to start sharing some of this reframing on there, and I will send a link out with more of those details. That's a great suggestion. Thanks a lot, Sue. Someone made a great comment. I've been in the prevention business for over 25 years, and this information is very refreshing. So thanks a lot, Jeannie, for that. I would definitely agree. When I started this communications role, I had a lot of the old perceptions in my mind of how to talk about child abuse. And going through this presentation and even working on it today, I continue to rethink about how we're talking about child abuse and prevention. So I'm glad you said that. I find it refreshing each time as well. Any other comments or questions? Anything you wanted to add, Kelly?
No, I think we've covered it.
Oh, good. Thanks, Mary. We had a good presentation. So great. If there's any other questions out there, we'll take those. And like I said, we're going to work on sharing a recording. And then I really like the idea of being able to start to show more examples So we'll work on some of that as well. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and sign off, but again, please keep in touch with us. Hopefully didn't overtalk you today, but we really enjoyed being able to share this with you again and look forward to any other questions you might have or any of the projects you want to work on in the future. So thank you again, and we will all be in touch.